Selecting proper AN size isn't complicated, but there is a little bit of math involved. So I'll show you how to do that today. Just going to concentrate on the common street sizes today, 6, 8, and 10, which I have here. And then on the far left, there's dash 4. But again, we're not going to really talk about it, but I have it in there just as a reference so you can kind of see the differences between them. Generally speaking, 3/8 inch fuel line is really most equivalent to dash 6, half inch is most equivalent to dash 8, and 5/8 is most equivalent to dash 10. Now, dash 6 and 3/8 line look pretty close, and they actually are, but if you look at what the inside diameter is, it's all we care about, is on the dash 6, you're 0.34 inches, and on 3/8 is obviously 0.375. So actually, the 3/8 fuel line is a little bit bigger than dash 6. So take that into consideration when you're making, the guess or judgment on what you're going to do for fuel line size. And just for comparison's sake, here's 5/16 on the left, 3/8 on the right, just so you can get a general idea of the size. So we'll start to take a look at some of these side by side so you can physically see the difference. Outside diameter is one thing, inside diameter is really all you need to care about. So just keep that in mind as you compare these. Here's dash 8 hose right next to the 3/8 fuel line. You can see that the dash 8 is quite a bit bigger. Now, when you compare dash 8 to the half-inch fuel line that we talked about earlier, inside diameter on most of the dash 8 hoses are 0.44, and half inch is obviously 0.50. So again, the AN sizes on the inside diameter where the flow measurements are the most critical are much smaller than they are with their inch size counterpart. Let's take a look at some fitting sizes here just so you can kind of get a reference between them all. Again, a little bit different. Obviously, the dash 4 is the really small stuff. Center, top, these are very don't flow a whole lot, but they're typically made more for nitrous lines. Dash 6 is a very common line. This is a twist lock hose end. Fairly common. I use fairly a lot of them anyway. And then dash 8, 10, and then the red and blue fitting is a dash 20. So if you're into really big movement of fluid, those are typically a lot of times used on coolant hoses, but just something to kind of get you a gauge of understanding what they all look like. Here's something that's a little interesting when you look at these. Now, these are dash 8 fittings that we're looking at right here, and they're a little different. So this one right here on the top is different than this one on the bottom. You see the diameter of the tubing is different. This one on the bottom is what's called a brazed fitting, where the tube ends are brazed together or brazed to the hose end or the ends that make up the hose end. So a little bit different. The diameter looks a little bit different, but they typically flow generally pretty close to the same. They're not too far off, but the size is definitely something to take into consideration. They are a little bulky. That bulkier fitting also is what they call a one-piece, or sometimes I've seen some manufacturers call them CNC. I think there's only a couple of U.S. manufacturers that are doing those. Vibrant is one of them. I believe Russell's new PTFE line. Well, I know Russell's new PTFE line is made from that same material. So anyway, just something to be cautious of when you're looking at fittings and the sizes that they are. Now let's get into the nitty gritty here. How do we determine what size fuel line we're going to need? And really, you've got to consider this in one major factor, and that's flow. How much flow? Everything else kind of revolves around that. Now, that's an obvious statement, but trust me when I say that doesn't get that way sometimes when people talk about certain aspects. What type of fuel is being used? Now, E10, E15, those are certainly much different on flow than if we're talking E85. E85, if you remember, needs a lot more volume, typically 25-30% more to get the same amount of power out of it as versus a regular, non-ethanol blended fuel. So you have to keep that into consideration. If you're going to run E85 on a street car, race car, whatever, it's great fuel. It does really good work for what it's designed to do when we're talking about performance, not when we're talking about, regular daily everyday drivers or kind of harsh on the system, but you got to take that into consideration if you're going to choose when you're choosing your fuel line. Naturally aspirated or boosted. Now that's a big one. Obviously, if it's an NA motor, the fuel volume is not going to be near as much. Your fuel consumption is typically higher on a supercharged or turbocharged application. I think that's fairly well known. Not a lot of reason to argue that point, but if you're an NA motor, then certainly it's part of the conversation. If you're boosted and running an intercooler, that can be a difference as well too. Now sometimes that's on the lower PSI boost applications. You know, if you're only running 5 or 6, a lot of times you can get away with not running an intercooler. But if you are running an intercooler, it can change the volume that the fuel goes through the system, because fuel's a coolant. It cools down internal things on the engine, valves, the combustion chamber, all of those little things it comes in contact with. It tends to pull a little bit of that and spit it out the exhaust. So understanding, what PSI and what size intercooler, or if you're going to run an intercooler at all. And probably the biggest factor here, or one of the biggest factors, is what's your horsepower goals. If you're going to run a 350 horse street motor, fun little cruiser, enjoyable, cruise around town, drive down the highway to, get to wherever you're going. That's one thing. If you're going to build an 800 horsepower street car, their fuel demands are totally different. The flow that needs to feed each one of those is different. So we'll take a look at all the math in here in just a second. Last little detail there is what pressure. Now, pressure we've talked about a number of times on other videos, and really it's the flow that we're concerned about, or the number that we need to look at it. But there are times when you can run a high pressure through a smaller injector, and it still makes a smaller injector flow more fuel. So it's just understanding all the combination of what you're working with. Now, I know this sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's really not that bad. But again, understanding all these things will help you pick out the fuel line size. Here are a couple of charts to consider. The first one here is pretty simple. We just talk about the AN size, and really when I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, dash 6, dash 8, dash 10 are really all I'm going to concentrate on here on the street. But that max flow rate is really what we're looking at. Now that's gallons per hour. You can convert that to liters per hour. Doesn't matter. Those numbers are critical because they fit into this next chart. Horsepower levels that you anticipate to be at, or you're currently at, whichever one you're doing. If you're building say you're building a 350 horsepower engine, a 500 horsepower engine, those numbers are fairly good to flow what you need up there up top. Now, if you are building that 500 horsepower engine, you can use dash 6 on an NA motor. Anything more than that, then yeah, you're going to get into dash 8, and certainly when you're getting into the big number stuff, you'll get into the dash 10. But take a look at that. It'll give you some guidelines. Always, 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 always consult with the fuel system company that you're dealing with. Doesn't matter who it is, whether it's DeechWorks or Fuel Lab or whoever. It doesn't matter. Have them dictate or give you the details of what they do and how they build the system, and ask them specifically what liters per hour that they're anticipating that you're going to need, and what size fuel lines you're going to need for the inlet and for the return. So hopefully those two charts kind of give you some basic details, but again, they're general guidelines. Always ask those questions. It'll do you a world of good when you get there. And in most cases, if you feel like it's too small, if you're at 500 and you go, well, I may put a turbocharger or a supercharger on later, then always go up. Go up in a number if you're really close to being dialed into where you think you need to be. Bonus points if you can figure out whose parking lot I'm standing in right now. I'll post pictures on Instagram on Monday. It'll give you a day or two to guess. But anyway, if you have any questions on this one, don't hesitate. Leave them down below. I'll be happy to answer them for you. I tried to make it as easy as possible and kind of do all the math for you. But follow those two charts. And like I say, the best advice I can give you is if you have any question, concern, you're not quite sure, just call the manufacturer of the fuel system you're going to use and go from there. We'll catch you guys on the next one. We'll see you.